My daughter with developmental disabilities is here. I'm doing drop-off delivery.
That infuriating line message came from my sister, and I rushed home in a panic. To my shock, there was my niece crying uncontrollably on my front porch. Leaving her in my sister's care is no longer an option. What does it mean to be a family? I'll teach her with everything I've got. My name is Mary. I'm a 43-year-old who loves baking. I've been into baking ever since I was a kid. What? Then I must be really good at it. Well, of course. I'm definitely one of the best around, for sure. Although there was that one time when the kids said that my chiffon cake was so dry. Sigh. But let me explain. Chiffon cake just isn't my strong suit. When I made muffins, my kids' friends loved that and envied my daughter. Even my kids gave a little smug look. So it's definitely not like I'm bad at baking. Well, what I'm trying to say is, whether you're good or bad at baking, these little moments of interaction with your kids are what make life enjoyable. Even the smallest things become important pieces of your daily life. That's what I think family is all about. But my sister's household was nothing like that. Let's go back to a few years ago. During spring break, when I went back to my parents' house, my sister Betty said this while watching TV.
Lately, it seems like there are so many kids with developmental disabilities. Why is that?
The show on TV wasn't even about developmental disabilities. Betty just blurted it out, completely out of context. Not only me, but my mom and my husband, who were there with us, were all taken aback. Unable to let it slide, I asked why she asked that question.
A coworker's child was recently diagnosed with a developmental disability.
Oh, really? And?
Apparently, it includes kids who can't sit still or who struggle academically.
I don't know much about it, but just from hearing that, it sounds like it could apply to pretty much any kid.
You know, I think Sarah might have a developmental disability.
What? Betty's words left me speechless. Sarah is Betty's daughter. She's my niece. I've adored Sarah since the day she was born, but she always seemed like a perfectly normal child to me. Why do you suddenly think that?
Well, compared to Kenny, she's, not very smart. She has no language skills.
Like you're one to talk.
This isn't a joke. It's like, she has terrible memory.
Betty said, passionately defending her opinion. I glanced at our mom, who tilted her head with a puzzled look. My husband, Chris, mirrored my mom's reaction perfectly, his face practically covered in question marks. To be honest, none of us knew much about developmental disabilities back then. Our knowledge was limited to a few things we'd heard on TV. We didn't have anyone like that in our lives to relate to. That said, did Sarah really seem like she had a developmental disability, as Betty claimed? She just looked like a normal kid to me. But since I wasn't living with Sarah every day, we didn't have enough evidence to tell Betty, her own mother, that she was wrong. Still, something about Betty's judgment didn't feel right, and I had this gut feeling that she was overthinking it. But Betty snapped.
You just don't get it, Mary. I've been studying so much about developmental disabilities, and I'm struggling. That's why I'm asking for help.
To me, It sounded less like she was asking for advice and more like she was venting. But, well, whatever, if she's really worried, she'll eventually take Sarah to the doctor or something. At the time, we all brushed it off optimistically. But then, when we went back to my parents' house for Christmas that year, something happened.
I knew it. Sarah has a developmental disability.
Betty announced this excitedly, and I couldn't shake the strange feeling it gave me. Betty's attitude was almost like she was happy that her guessing of Sarah having a developmental disability was not wrong. It almost seemed like she was enjoying herself. Even I, when the thought of what if Sarah really does have a developmental disability crossed my mind, found myself worrying about her future.
Have you taken her to the doctor?
No, I haven't. But I have proof.
Proof? Stop talking like you've just uncovered a criminal.
Despite Mom's attempt to scold her, Betty pressed on with her argument.
She's starting first grade next year, and she still can't write the alphabet.
What? No. If she's still in preschool, that's normal. Grace just started school this year, and there are still plenty of letters she can read but can't write.
Well, that's because Grace is your child. Are you saying it's genetic?
Betty's smug attitude, as if she had just made some profound statement, rubbed both Chris and me the wrong way. Mom, meanwhile, looked nervous, clearly worried about the tension rising between us. I held back the urge to snap at Betty, exhaled slowly, and let it go for now. Anyway, I really think there's no need to rush. There are plenty of kids in elementary school who can't write yet. She'll pick it up eventually. Betty frowned, clearly not convinced by my words.
But Kenny could write the alphabet ages ago when he was in preschool.
Well, I stopped myself before saying that it was because Kenny was a genius. Sarah was nearby, after all. Kenny is Betty's eldest son. He's Sarah's older brother. He's always been a bright child, the kind of kid who could calculate dates on a calendar or read road signs effortlessly. After our late father casually remarked that Kenny was a genius, Betty changed completely and started putting all her energy into Kenny's education. Now he attends some kind of lesson 5 days a week, and at home, it's all about studying. I've never seen Kenny playing like a typical kid. Everyone has told Betty to let Kenny have more freedom. But Betty always brushes it off, insisting that Kenny is the one actually wants that. And Kenny himself says that he wants to study more because it makes his mom and dad happy. Everyone but Betty and her husband could see this wasn't good for the kid, but since Kenny didn't seem to mind, it became hard for us, as outsiders, to intervene in their family matters. Every child develops at their own pace. You can't compare them. Betty frowned, looking clearly dissatisfied with my words. Then Betty's husband, Tom, jumped into our conversation with a smug look and said that we should not hinder a child's development by saying things like that. There are first graders who can't write as well as Sarah right after starting school. I think it's a bit much to label her as having a developmental disability over something like that.
Well then, maybe those kids have developmental disabilities too. Oh, my apologies. Wasn't Grace also unable to write letters? Typical, coming from you who are dim-witted.
Sensing my irritation, Chris stepped in.
Well, from what I hear, Sarah seems to be doing just fine.
But Tom exaggeratedly shook his head.
She doesn't listen. She's restless. She doesn't express her own opinions. And she's terrible at socializing in group settings. She perfectly fits all the symptoms of a developmental disability, doesn't she?
Tom said this with a smug look, as if he showed perfect proof. When she's playing with Grace, she seems calm and listens just fine. From what I've seen, she doesn't seem to have any issues with group activities either. At my words, Tom snorted dismissively.
You just don't get it, do you, Mary?
Excuse me?
She's way too incompetent compared to Kenny, who's 3 years older. Kenny can do so much more.
Well, of course Kenny can do more. He's 3 years older. If Kenny, at 3 years older, couldn't do more, then you should be the one taking him to a doctor. I couldn't help but stare at Tom, dumbfounded.
From a medical standpoint, it's obvious that Sarah's condition is a developmental disability.
Medically speaking. But Tom, you're not a doctor.
I always say this. My siblings all graduated from state universities. That makes me smart.
Okay. I couldn't help but chuckle awkwardly. Tom often claims that he is also smart, since all his siblings graduated from state universities. For the record, Tom graduated from a private university. His teachers had advised him not to apply to any state schools because they were certain he wouldn't pass, but he ignored them and applied anyway, and predictably, he failed. In the end, he went to his safety school and now works as a manager at a supermarket. Despite all this, Tom insists that he has the same brain as someone who graduated from a state university. What on earth is he talking about? It took time after Tom and Betty got married that I learned even his family kept him at arm's length.
But still, it's important to have a professional check things out.
Chris subtly encouraged Tom to take Sarah for a proper medical checkup. And then,
No, there's no need. It's not just my evaluation. I've also gained insights from something like a doctor.
everyone except Betty's family suddenly had question marks floating above their heads.
Well, what do you mean by something like a doctor?
Chris cautiously asked.
A health show on TV. It perfectly matched my diagnosis, so I think it's very credible.
As we all groaned at Tom's ridiculous statement, Betty chimed in to make things worse.
That's right. The special show they aired recently was amazing. One of my coworkers watched it, got worried, went to the hospital, and they found the exact condition the show talked about. You can't underestimate these programs.
Seriously? We were all left speechless at this couple who seemed to think watching TV was equivalent to getting a medical evaluation. Finally, Mom, unable to hold back her exasperation, advised them to take her to the doctor.
Stop interfering with our parenting. You ignorant people should just keep quiet.
Betty snapped and stormed off, taking Tom and their eldest son with her. They left Sarah behind.
She's unbelievable. If she wants to act all high and mighty, she should at least take proper care of Sarah.
Mom muttered with a sigh of exasperation. And she wasn't wrong. Fortunately, Sarah was playing with Grace and seemed to be smiling, but she knew her family had left her behind. I had noticed a fleeting look of disappointment cross her face. That smile of hers was forced, a brave front. Watching Sarah, my chest ached. She shouldn't have to worry about putting on a brave face for us. Seeing her clearly trying to read the room and adjust her behavior, I became even more certain. Sarah does not have a developmental disability. After some time, Betty and Tom returned home in high spirits, apparently having enjoyed a shopping trip with their eldest son. As soon as they got back, a family meeting was held, this time with only the adults.
Have you done this before? Leaving Sarah behind while you go shopping?
Mom glared at Betty, her expression furious.
She's just staying home. What's the problem?
You shouldn't leave Sarah home alone. Why don't you take her with you?
Because she doesn't listen. It's discipline.
Then scold her about it. Leaving her behind without explanation is just cruel.
With all due respect, we provide Sarah with meals and a proper education. Why are we being criticized like this?
Chris and I couldn't hold back and raised our voices at Tom, who had cut into Betty and Mom's conversation, telling that they should not do like that. But Tom, completely unfazed, brushed us off. His detached attitude made it clear he didn't see anything wrong with their actions. Irritated by his behavior, I couldn't help but jump in, saying something so basic like it's praiseworthy. Do you really expect us to just nod and agree?
This is a matter for our household, so could you stay out of it, Mary?
If it's a matter for your household, then it's also a matter for mine. Sarah is family. She's my blood too. If my precious niece is being treated unfairly, I can't stay silent.
You're exaggerating. Every family has situations where a child stays home alone for a bit.
So, I assume Kenny stays home alone sometimes too. If all the kids are equally taking turns being left home alone, I'll drop it. Though I'd be lying if I said I didn't have concerns about leaving a preschooler alone in the house. At my words, Tom went silent, and Betty looked down. It seems Kenny has never been left to stay home alone. They didn't need to say anything. Their body language said it all.
If you really think Sarah might have a developmental disability, doesn't that make it even worse to leave her alone at home?
Chris added, his tone critical. Both Mom and I nodded in agreement, thinking he was absolutely right. However,
She's a child who can't even handle staying home alone, so we're teaching her how. Stay out of it, outsiders.
Betty shouted and slammed the table with a loud bang. After 2 hours of trying to reason with my sister and her husband, the conversation remained at an impasse, and we had to call it a day. Needless to say, the sulking couple left for home earlier than planned the next morning. Throughout their visit, it was painfully clear that Betty and Tom doted on Kenny while treating Sarah differently. Take mealtime, for instance. If there was shrimp, Kenny's favorite, on their plates, they'd give it to him, but they never did anything like that for Sarah. On the contrary, they'd even tell her to give Kenny some of her shrimp. Sarah, likely used to this dynamic, would only show mild reluctance before obediently complying with her parents' demands. I'm sure my sister and her husband see this behavior and think that she doesn't express her opinions. But if expressing your opinions gets you nowhere, of course you'd stop speaking up altogether. Betty and Tom also made promises to buy games only for Kenny, and their conversations were always about him, never directing any attention or questions toward Sarah. There were countless instances where their favoritism was blatantly obvious. Each time, I wanted to reprimand them, but thinking about how Sarah might feel if I did, it was hard to speak up in the moment. I had no choice but to stay silent, which eventually led to that family meeting. After seeing all of this firsthand, Chris and I began having more discussions about what we could do to help Sarah. Then one day,
Just for today, can you look after Sarah?
with that, Betty showed up at our house unannounced, bringing Sarah along. The suddenness of it all left Sarah looking confused. She probably understood better than anyone how inconvenient it was for us to be asked something like this out of the blue. So I didn't press Betty for details and quickly agreed to take Sarah in for the day.
Thanks so much for watching her. You've been such a big help.
A few hours later, Betty showed up at our house at the agreed time to pick Sarah up. "Sorry for the short notice," she said. So even scatterbrained Betty must have felt a little guilty about it. "That's fine, but why so sudden?"
Well, Kenny's friends and their moms were coming over to our place. And, it's just that, with Sarah there, it would have been, well,
What do you mean by that?
Kenny's friends are the ones he takes lessons with. Most of their families are doctors or from high society backgrounds. If they found out he has a sister with a developmental disability, it'd be humiliating, right? So, I hid Sarah here.
Betty stuck out her tongue with a sheepish grin, but I couldn't hide the frustration welling up inside me. What? Listen here. Whether Sarah has a developmental disability or not, it's unacceptable for a parent to call their own daughter an embarrassment.
It's the truth, so what can I do about it?
This is unbelievable. Instead of trying to impress your mom friends, how about focusing on being a better parent for your children?
I don't need to hear that from you, someone who's only raising one child. For your information, I got married and had kids before you did.
Betty sulked, grabbed Sarah's hand roughly, and drove off. I'll never forget how Sarah glanced back at me with a sad expression for just a moment. Not long after that, Betty and her husband showed up at our house together. Alongside them were Kenny and Sarah. "You're showing up unannounced again. What do you want this time?"
I need you to take care of Sarah.
"And what about Kenny?"
Kenny, my husband, and I are heading out for a one-night, 2-day camping trip, so don't worry about us.
"What? You're planning to leave Sarah behind while you go on an overnight trip?"
That's why I'm here asking you to watch her.
"Look, I keep telling you."
Enough. I get it already. This is the last time I'll leave Sarah with you, so it's fine, isn't it? Besides, this isn't just a casual trip. It's a networking event for Kenny to bond with his high society friends. Don't interfere.
I thought this last time too. Does a child really need that kind of network? Kenny would be poor if you just don't let him relax and enjoy being a kid.
Of course he needs it. The only reason I put up with these annoying mom-friend dynamics is for Kenny's sake. Don't say something as rude as, "Poor Kenny." What do you even know, Mary?
Maybe I don't understand your feelings, but I was a child once too, so I can imagine how a kid might feel.
Kenny isn't like other kids. He's a genius.
There was no reasoning with her. Seeing that this conversation was going nowhere, I agreed to take care of Sarah under 2 conditions. Betty had to call us before coming to pick her up, and she had to arrive on time for the 10:30 a.m. pickup she had set. Although Betty looked slightly displeased, I couldn't care less. Without even saying goodbye to Sarah, Betty and Tom got into the car, with only Kenny giving Sarah an apologetic wave as they drove off. What heartless parents, truly. Fortunately, at our house, Grace was overjoyed to have Sarah over and stuck to her like glue, playing with her from start to finish, so Sarah didn't seem lonely at all. To Grace, Sarah seemed like a little sister.
I wish she could just be part of our family.
She blurted out things that adults wouldn't dare say so casually. Sarah even said that she didn't want to go back, which made it clear she enjoyed her time at our house. The next morning, however, the agreed pickup time came and went without any word from Betty. Of course, no one showed up to get Sarah. I tried calling her cell phone, but it wouldn't connect, leaving me worried that they might have been in an accident. Until
Thanks so much for watching her.
Betty and Tom showed up at our house in the evening, grinning and offering no apology. Hey, didn't I tell you to contact me before coming over? And on top of that, what's with not showing up at the agreed time? I couldn't help but raise my voice. Even with Sarah present, I just couldn't hold back anymore.
Don't gripe about the small stuff. We came to pick her up, didn't we? What's the big deal?
Of course you're supposed to come pick her up. You left your child at someone else's house. Don't treat it so carelessly.
What's with you? You've been so irritated lately. Menopause?
Oh, come on. It's way too early for that.
Tom burst into loud laughter at Betty's sarcastic comment. God, what an infuriating couple. Look, I hate to keep repeating myself, but you two really need to rethink how you're raising your kids.
We are thinking about it. That's why we've signed Kenny up for all those lessons. Unlike you, who doesn't even bother to give Grace any extracurriculars.
We don't push Grace into activities because she's made it clear she doesn't want to do them. We're respecting her choices.
Well, we respect Kenny's wishes too. Right, Kenny? You enjoy your lessons and studying, don't you?
Betty's words were met with a hesitant nod and an awkward smile from Kenny. See? Even Kenny.
Anyway, I'm so done with your nagging. We're taking Sarah home now.
Wait a minute. We're not done talking. Betty yanked Sarah by the arm and shoved her into the car. Ignoring my protests, Tom started the engine, and the two of them drove off selfishly once again. How infuriating. Just as I was fuming, the next day rolled around. While I was out shopping, I got a message from Betty online.
Hey, you love Sarah, don't you?
What's this about all of a sudden? Well, of course I do. She's my niece, so that's obvious.
Then we've reached an agreement.
Agreement?
Sarah with a developmental disability has been dropped off at your front door. Since it seems like you're not home, you'd better hurry back. She might be crying all alone right now. From today on, she's your daughter, so make sure you focus on parenting properly.
I stared in disbelief at the unserious message from Betty. I quickly called her, but she didn't pick up. In fact, it seemed like her phone was turned off. Is this a joke? But if it's real? A terrible feeling washed over me, and I rushed home as fast as I could. And then, there, in front of my door, was Sarah. She was sobbing uncontrollably. She was face down on the ground, completely ignoring her surroundings, her shoulders hunched as she cried. I had never seen Sarah like this before. Sarah. I ran to her and pulled her into a hug. She clung to me, her tears soaking my shirt. I didn't need to ask what had happened. I already knew. Betty still wasn't answering her phone, and Tom's phone was turned off, so it was safe to assume this was a deliberate act by the two of them. Betty had said that from today on, Sarah was my daughter. In other words, it was clear that Betty and Tom were never coming back to pick up Sarah. I hugged the crying Sarah tightly once more, silently vowing that I would never forgive Betty and Tom, and that I shouldn't forgive them. Fine, I'll gladly take Sarah in. Less than a week later, my husband and I went straight to Betty's house. We brought my mom and Chris's mom along as witnesses. Our goal was simple: to officially obtain their parental consent to make Sarah our child. The two moms were there as witnesses. Chris and I had already discussed it thoroughly and decided that we would take Sarah in even if it took time. We were a little anxious about whether it would work out, since we already have a daughter, but when Sarah stayed over at our house, seeing the kids play together so happily erased any doubts we had. Even Sarah had said that it would be hard being at home, and she wanted to be my child, so we were fully prepared to welcome her into our family. Though our thorough preparation seemed to take Betty and Tom by surprise, they agreed without much hesitation. They cheerfully filled out the paperwork, and shortly afterward, Sarah officially became our adopted daughter. 3 months later, Betty suddenly showed up at our house. What do you want?
Well, can you give Sarah back to me?
What? No way. What's this all about now?
Please. That girl, turns out she's a genius.
What are you talking about? Seeing my puzzled expression, Betty launched into her story, as if she had been dying for someone to ask. Apparently, just a few days earlier, one of Kenny's friends' moms had casually remarked to Betty that she had never seen Sarah. Then the mom revealed something Betty didn't even know.
Your daughter is incredibly talented at painting, isn't she? I saw her work that won the kids' art competition. It's hanging at that bank. It's truly amazing, like something an adult would create. The colors are stunning.
What?
Betty was left speechless by the mom friend's comment. Well, of course she was. She probably didn't even remember that Sarah liked drawing. In fact, during the Christmas visit, Betty had snatched away Sarah's crayons, telling her to stop drawing all the time.
I was so shocked. I didn't even know she'd entered a competition. Turns out she's not like Kenny with academics. She's a genius in the arts. She's not developmentally disabled at all.
Betty laughed loudly, but I couldn't help bursting into laughter myself.
Mary? Was that really that funny?
Oh, it's hilarious. Of course I'm laughing.
What?
I told you from the beginning that Sarah wasn't developmentally disabled, and it was me who submitted her drawing to the competition.
What?
To be exact, her preschool teacher told me her work was excellent and suggested entering it into the competition. That's all there was to it. Actually, the teacher mentioned they had made similar suggestions in the past, too.
No way.
It's true, but the teacher said they were disappointed that you never took an interest. It prevented Sarah from having opportunities to grow. The preschool that Betty, now a full-fledged tiger mom, chose for Sarah is well known in the area as a place that focuses on nurturing talents. It's filled with bright kids, athletically gifted ones, and those with unique skills. The preschool's concept is to help uncover and develop the hidden talents of its students. It seems that Sarah had discovered her talent for art there, but her parents were only interested in academic abilities and completely ignored everything else. In other words, even with parents like you, Sarah was able to shine and show her abilities. But the ones who kept stifling her potential time and time again were you too.
Oh no. We really missed out. Oh well. Anyway, Mary, give Sarah back, okay?
Betty stretched out both hands in a gimme gesture, making her outrageous demand with no shame whatsoever. Even though she's my sister, her cluelessness was so absurd that I couldn't help but smirk as my lips curled up. Once the adoption was finalized, it's no longer a matter of giving her back or not. Both you and I are Sarah's parents now. If Sarah wants to return to your home, I won't stop her.
Oh, is that so? Then she'll obviously choose us.
Betty said with a smug smile. Are you sure about that? Sarah, come here for a moment. When I called out to Sarah, who had been playing inside, she came out hesitantly. By the way, now she calls me Mama Auntie, which is a nickname Sarah came up with, blending her former auntie with Mama. Since I'm now both her aunt and her mom, it's not wrong, so I didn't bother correcting her. Besides, it's adorable. Betty tried to rush toward her, but Kenny suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path.
What? Kenny? Why are you here? Shouldn't you be at your lesson right now?
Betty asked, her voice tinged with confusion as Kenny stiffened. Behind him, Grace was watching nervously, her eyes darting between Kenny and Sarah. Not long after Sarah came to live with us, Kenny started visiting too. His piano class is nearby, isn't it?
Yes.
Kenny was pretending to go to his piano lessons, but was actually coming here.
Why didn't you tell me? The tuition isn't cheap. Don't drag Kenny into useless playtime. He's a genius. He doesn't have time for...
See, that's exactly the problem.
What?
The first day Kenny came here, he broke down crying. He said he couldn't stand his life anymore. But he didn't want to tell you because he thought it would make you sad. You're spending so much money on him, and he felt it would all be wasted if he spoke up.
If he knew that, then why?
As Betty tried to scold Kenny, I couldn't help but raise my voice sharply. Don't you understand Kenny's feelings yet? Every single day has been unbearable for him, but he couldn't say anything because you keep forcing your ideals on him. I've told you over and over to pay more attention to your kids as a parent.
I've been doing this for Kenny's sake.
You say it's for Kenny, but look at where it's gotten him. Wake up already. Kenny, clutching at my waist, burst into uncontrollable sobs. I must have voiced all the feelings he had wanted to express.
I thought if I made Mom and Dad happy, they'd stop being mean to Sarah. I thought if I were a better boy, they'd treat her more kindly, too. But now she's living with Mary, I just can't take it anymore. I don't want to be separated from Sarah.
Large tears streamed down from Kenny's big, wide eyes. Beside him, Sarah clung tightly to Kenny's shirt, crying just as hard. Seeing them like that made my heart ache, as if someone were squeezing it tightly. Yet, Betty knelt before Kenny and had the nerve to say that she was the one who should be crying. For a brief moment, I nearly raised my hand to slap her in frustration, but a soft slap sound echoed instead.
What?
Betty, clutching her cheek in shock, stood frozen. In front of her, Sarah's small hand was trembling and red from the impact. Even though it couldn't have hurt, given the strength of a small child, the sharp look of hatred in Sarah's eyes as she glared at Betty made her flinch.
Don't make Kenny cry.
Sarah's harsh words, shouted through trembling lips, brought tears streaming down Betty's face.
Even you think I'm the bad guy?
Of course she does. This is the result of your parenting. Not a single person. Not one child sees you as a mother to look up to anymore.
That can't be.
So just leave. This is over. You showing your face here only makes it worse for the kids. They're the ones who suffer.
Wait. I know you don't want to give Sarah back because she's a genius, but she's my daughter. I gave birth to her.
No. Even if she grows up to be a failure, I'll love her just the same. I didn't take Sarah in because she's a genius. And Kenny, I love him just as much. That's why I can't leave either of them with someone who only values kids based on their talents. I shoved Betty out of the doorway and slammed the door shut. For a while, I could hear her sobbing theatrically outside like the tragic heroine, but needless to say, I completely ignored it. After that, Betty lied to her mom friends, claiming that she had sent her daughter on a homestay with her parents abroad, instead of admitting that she had given Sarah up for adoption. But as time passed and Sarah remained absent, the sharp and well-connected mom group began to gossip about Betty's family. And for good reason. Since that day, Kenny had seemingly given up on his parents entirely and stopped returning home, instead staying at my mother's house. Why didn't he come to my house where Sarah was? Apparently, he thought it would be less of a burden on me and believed that staying with his grandmother would make it easier to handle any legal issues if they arose. Whether his reasoning was correct or not, I couldn't help but admire how much thought he put into it. It proved yet again how clever he was for his age. After some drama and a lot of persistence from both Kenny and my mother, Kenny was formally taken in by her. With both children gone, Betty's household drew even more disapproving looks from the neighbors than before, which further strained the couple's already fragile relationship. Tom reportedly blamed Betty for her poor parenting, saying it had ruined their social standing. Meanwhile, Tom himself was ridiculed by his own siblings for being a man who can't even keep his family together, and the resulting frustration was directed back at Betty. From our perspective, they were both equally at fault. In the end, after about a year of constant fighting, the two divorced. Betty even apologized to her 2 young children, however, but the children firmly refused, saying they would never return to their parents' care. Betty now lives alone. Tom moved back to his parents' house, but from what I've heard, he's constantly mocked as a failure in both love and life, making his situation equally miserable. It seems both of them will live out their lives in lonely isolation. After that, our family and my mother moved into a 2-generation home together. It was so that Kenny and Sarah could live together. Now that the kids are older, they're full of energy, and Grace joins in the daily chaos, making for a lively household. After moving in with my mother, Kenny gave up all his extracurricular lessons. Of course, this was decided after asking him what he truly wanted. According to him, he didn't like any of the lessons. Now Kenny spends every day playing games with Sarah and the others, joining in their pretend play, and showing what a caring and responsible big brother he can be. What's surprising is that Kenny doesn't study at all, yet his grades never drop in the slightest. And after Sarah started elementary school, we realized she seems to be the same type. It takes her some time to grasp things, but fundamentally, she's very smart. The 2 of them excel in their grades without even studying.
2 out of 3 of us are geniuses, so I'll just fully embrace being the goofy one.
Well, Kenny, being the oldest, helps Grace with her studies, so it should be fine. In times like these, not needing to rely on tutoring schools is something I'm deeply grateful for. Kenny excels in academics, Sarah in the arts, and my daughter, well, let's just say she's been influenced by the 2 and developed a wide range of interests. As a result, her hobbies have expanded, and despite being just a child, she's become quite skilled at cooking. Why cooking, you ask? Well, I've always had a hobby of baking, but I've never had much of a knack for presentation. That's where Sarah stepped in, offering suggestions. For some reason, Grace, who had been watching from the sidelines, became eager to put Sarah's advice into practice. And as a result, my daughter's skills improved dramatically. What does Kenny contribute, you ask? At times like that, Kenny teams up with Chris to fully embrace the role of food tasters. Meanwhile, my mother happily watches us with a smile, capturing those moments in photos. Ever since our family grew and started living together, my mother seems to have developed a new hobby, photography. It's incredible how just a few years have completely transformed each of our lives, bringing more smiles to everyone. The loan for the 2-family house may have added to our expenses, but seeing all these smiles more than makes up for it. It's worth every penny.